I'd like to kick things off by acknowledging we're here on Anawan country, and it's my pleasure to acknowledge the elders of Anawan country, past, present, and emerging. Before we get into things, I just want to also acknowledge what's sitting in front of you for people that are here tonight. There are, because this is a creative, artistic-themed Science in the Club, we've given you some art supplies. You'll find big sheets of butcher's paper and colored pencils on your tables, and you can express your thoughts and feelings creatively throughout the night. The Wicklow asks you please don't draw on their nice white tablecloths. That would be great, thanks. You'll also see a couple of pieces of paper floating around. You have answer sheets for the trivia section that's going to be happening later on. You have some feedback sheets that would help us run these events in the future. You're also going to see a sheet we put out that we would like your creative visions on it, because there's sort of dual purposes for running this event tonight. We're celebrating all things science and all things art. We're also acknowledging the fact that the New England Northwest Regional Science Hub, along with Inspiring Australia, that brings us these events to Armidale, is also bringing something to the Armidale War Memorial Library. They're getting installed a science-themed mural to go upstairs in the youth section, and we would like the community's input into what should be included on this mural. Obviously, we have lots of scientists in town that think they know what science is all about, but we want to know what you think. What does science mean to you? We want as many people as we can to be submitting ideas for what they think should be included in this mural. We'll take all these ideas and try and incorporate as many of them as we can into the mural that will get installed in the library next month, and we'll have an official, launch and activation of that mural once it's up. So feel free to scribble away. Tonight you can hand in your entries to us before you leave. You can take the forms and give them to someone else if they have some great ideas, or you can drop them off in person at the library. They have a little drop-off booth there. So how tonight will work is we have 3 incredible speakers. We'll be hearing from each of those. We'll have a quick break, then we'll come back for the round of trivia, so make sure you're paying attention during the talks. Once we've done the trivia, we'll have a quick Q&A with each of the speakers, and then we'll reveal all our trivia answers. So, our speakers tonight, later on we'll be hearing from Rachel Parsons, the director of NIRAM, Dr. Tommy Leung, parasitologist and artist extraordinaire from the University of New England. But first up, it is my honor, my pleasure, to introduce our first speaker. He's tall, he's handsome, he's a sought-after scientist, artist. Give him a round of applause. It's Dr. James O'Hanlon. Dr. James. All right, got it. I want to start this whole conversation getting you thinking about art, thinking about science, how they might intersect. And I want to present to you this. Ponder this for a minute. Does anyone know what it is? Does anybody know what form of art it is? What form of craft it is? Crochet. It's crochet. Now, when we think crochet, we probably think doilies, we probably think, teapot cozies, we probably think, handmade beanies from grandma. But this right here is also one of the best models, best physical simulations we have of a phenomenon called hyperbolic non-Euclidean geometry. What is hyperbolic non-Euclidean geometry, I hear you ask? Well, I'm not a mathematician, so I'm going to bugger up the explanation of it. But the types of geometry that we were taught in school were probably Euclidean geometry, things that happen in two-dimensional space. So if we look up the top at this triangle here, we were taught things like all the inside angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. We were probably taught Pythagoras' theorem. We were taught about things like sines and tans and cosines and all these rules as to how to calculate what goes on with the triangle. All that works great in 2 dimensions. Once you add a 3rd dimension to a flat surface, those rules go out the window, and we have all new types of geometries, and we can have strange things like this triangle down the bottom in the middle here. You might be looking at it going, well, James, that's not a triangle, it's got wobbly lines in it. Well, non-Euclidean geometry, technically these lines are straight, and we can have triangles where the angles can add up to less than 180 degrees. These 2 lines to the right of the triangle in non-Euclidean spaces are technically parallel, even though they're further apart at the ends than they are in the middle. This yellow circle here is a 2D representation of another non-Euclidean space where all of these triangles are actually the same shape and size. And this is a really odd thing to grasp your head around. Imagine being a math teacher trying to teach non-Euclidean geometry. And you might be thinking, oh, what does this matter? This is all just theoretical maths, who cares? Well, it's actually not theoretical. Hyperbolic geometry exists all around us. Just look at the lattice in your cupboard. It has these flat surfaces that don't play by 2-dimensional rules. For things like corals, these are ways of photosynthesizing organisms to increase their surface area beyond a theoretical 2-dimensional maximum. One very clever mathematician at Cornell University called Dana Tyneman figured out a little while ago that crochet was actually a really, really great way of physically modeling these geometric surfaces. And she's published this in scientific research articles, and she's also published crochet books teaching you how to crochet these mathematical concepts, and has been able to demonstrate how this works, including things like up at the top in the middle there is a surface of pentagons, and each corner of that pentagon has a perfect 90-degree angle, which in 2D space isn't possible. The one in the middle, again, these are all straight lines on that piece of crochet. You can grab either end and they're all perfectly straight, but in this 3-dimensional space they don't appear it. Margaret Wertheim over here on the left, she's taken this concept and has used it as a teaching tool, taking it out to community groups, women's groups, indigenous groups, getting people to start crocheting the shapes of these corals, because even though these people might not understand the fancy algorithms that go behind geometry, they know how to knit and crochet, and the pieces that they've made have been shown in art galleries all around the world. So I guess I'll take you back to that original question. Oh, am I lost slide controlling in? Is this art or is this science? What does it represent most? We're going to be exploring, I guess, that concept a lot later on, but what I would like to talk about is not so much the intersection of art and science, but what artists and scientists are. Anyone recognize this Goldilocks? That's Leonardo da Vinci. Can I have a quick show of hands? Who would consider Leo an artist? Well, spoiler alert. There was a time when clever bods like him weren't really shuffled away in different ends of university campuses where scientists hang out one end and artists hang out the other. These were smart people who were expected to explore and understand the world from a range of different avenues and perspectives. And despite our sort of desire to split up these two fields of interest, this type of person, this artist-scientist, hasn't disappeared, and I'm going to argue that artists and scientists are actually one and the same. Here's some more recent examples. Oh. Anyone recognize this stunning specimen? Brian May, famous for being the guitarist of Queen. You know what else he's famous for? Being a great big whopping nerd, that's right. Brian May started his PhD in astrophysics before Queen got massive. Put it on hiatus for, 30-odd years, turns out his field of astrophysics wasn't all that interesting because nobody touched it in 30 years. And he went back to it later on in life and pretty much picked up where he left off and finished his doctorate in 2017. Anyone recognize her? This is Beatrix Potter. What did Beatrix Potter write? Children's books, Peter Rabbit. Yes, she also wrote Les Champignons. Beatrix Potter was a world-renowned influential mycologist, a fungus taxonomy and diversity expert. She described and discovered a whole bunch of fungi, species, truffles, lichens, all sorts of things. Anyone know who this is? He's a scientist, famous scientist. This is Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. Famous for his discoveries in quantum physics. He's also famous for whatever the hell this is. Richard Feynman was a definition of a polymath. He had so many different interests, from science to language to culture, and bongo playing was one of his biggest passions, and this is him getting ready for Carnivale one year. Now, what is it about science and art that makes scientists and artists so common? Are they sort of driven by similar goals? And I think they are. I think both science and art are essentially kind of superpowers that let you bring into existence things that weren't there before, be they pieces of knowledge or be they pieces of art. And I'm going to go through a quick example using a particular scientist. And I could use Leonardo da Vinci, I could use Richard Feynman. I'm going to use myself. Yes, I'm drawing parallels between Leonardo da Vinci and myself. Because, whereas Leonardo da Vinci may have painted this, what he didn't paint is this. I painted this. Leo can't get credit for that. Yes, that's an octopus in a trench coat. His name is Mr. Niebles. And if you've ever heard me talk before, you've probably heard me talk about this sort of stuff. My day job for a very long time has been as what you'd call a behavioral ecologist. I study animal behavior, how they communicate, how they interact with the world, and things like ants and spiders and praying mantises and stick insects. And if I were some sort of a superhero, and we could say that by day I was a little mild-mannered behavioral ecologist, by night I'm this. Look, it's fair to say my art, it's pretty highbrow, guys. I don't expect you to understand the broad sweeping cultural commentary I'm making. Just a brief introduction. Top right, they're drought-proof fish. Up top in the middle, that's a marsupial mole. Marsupial moles don't have eyeballs, but this one's into steampunk cosplay, so he's living out his dreams. There's some eggs down the bottom. There's a Scotch egg. It's a deviled egg. It's an egg in a chicken suit. And you might be wondering, how do these two passions and desires of mine go together? How do I see them as similar? And it's because of this whole thing that I can bring things into existence that weren't there before, and it's an incredibly rewarding way of essentially justifying your own existence. So, as an example, when I started doing research as a scientist, I started working on praying mantises. I started working on these guys over on the left. These are tree-running mantises. We get up through far north Queensland and the Northern Territory. And getting towards my master's project, looking at these guys, I kind of thought, well, that's great. I might want to work on another insect next, sort of broaden my horizons. That was until I read an article about these guys here on the right. This is an orchid mantis. It's a praying mantis in Southeast Asia. Looks a hell of a lot like a flower, and there were these ideas floating around old research papers saying that it probably looks so much like a flower it can attract pollinators as prey. And I thought, that's really cool. I want to find out more about it. Went looking for it and realized we actually didn't know if that was possible. No one had ever studied it. And that, I guess, is when my little science brain kind of went, I could study that. as a scientist, I have the power to bring that information to light. And I guess I couldn't just let it go. And 5 years and a PhD later, I'd finished up a project studying this animal and found out, yeah, sure enough, they are so flower-like that things like bees and flies and beetles will just fly straight up to them, kind of into their open mouths almost. Now, that little discovery is not changing the world, it's not curing some grand disease, but that's a little piece of information that I have been able to bring to the world as a scientist. It's a little tiny puzzle piece in a much more larger puzzle, and I find that very rewarding. I also find the same thing doing art, and the example I want to use starts with the word Staardvark. Now, this story starts with me lying in bed, not being able to sleep, mind wandering off somewhere, realizing if an aardvark went to space, you could call it a Staardvark. Now, and this is one of those moments where, some cosmic vibe goes out, because my partner Siobhan obviously knew that I was thinking about something very deep and meaningful, and turned around and said, "What are you thinking about?" And so I told her. And I think this is when I knew I should probably marry this woman, because she sat up with me for the next half an hour brainstorming other animals that begin with AR that you could turn into astronauts, like starmadillo, starantula, starangutan. No, that doesn't work. And once this idea was in my head, I'd come up with this little sort of brigade of characters and realized I don't just have to think about them, I could bring them to life. And once these ideas are in your head, you can't not act on them. So I just had to start sketching, and here's my initial designs for what a Staardvark might look like. Here is a ptarmigan. There's a type of bird called a ptarmigan, so it became a ptarmigan. Anyone know what these are? Starwalls. Nice, and these little designs become more elaborate. Who knows who's up front and center? Anyone? Heard of a marmoset? A starmoset? Staardvark up the back. There's a bird called a pardalote, became a stardalote on the right. Over on the left, anyone know what this one is? It's a type of fish. Starfish, nice. It's a type of fish called a garfish. Starfish, it's funnier than you get it. And so anyway, eventually I just had to bring these characters into some sort of fully fleshed reality. And that's a little superpower that you have doing art. And again, I'm not creating the Mona Lisa here. I'm not going to get hung up at the Guggenheim or anything. But it was a little way for me to exercise this superpower of actually changing the world around me, essentially, of bringing something to existence that wasn't there before. Just like my research discoveries are little tiny bits of information that will go on in history and live their own little lives. Hope maybe one day my little Staardvark will have a little life of his own. That's my perspective on science and art, but I think there's someone in the room could give a much better perspective, a much more sophisticated perspective on the arts side of things. That's it for me. Could you please welcome to the stage Director of the New England Regional Arts Museum, Rachel Parsons.
Okay, and then this guy. So just pressing that one. Okay. Hi. I think the Staardvark could be in the Guggenheim one day. The Mona Lisa didn't start in the Louvre. It got later. Thank you so much for having me. For those who don't know me, as James said, I'm Rachel Parsons. I'm the director of New England Regional Art Museum, and I was kind of geared up to have a big fight with the scientists. On our page, we did talk about fighting to the death, and I'm a little bit disappointed in this polite discourse where we're all agreeing with each other. But we are, so that's nice too. So the intersection of art and science, it has its roots in the Renaissance. This is not a new idea, and it's something that has a really long continuation. And I think that the reason why these things go so well together is because artists and scientists are doing the same things. They are questioning the big questions. They're imagining possible solutions. They're coming up with creative solutions for problems that exist. They dream big. They think with complexity. And as James said, they make new things that didn't exist before. So they share a common purpose, and they also share a common methodology in a lot of respects. So our practices are based in experimentation, creative problem solving, and research. And so this assertion that there's a dichotomy, I think is inaccurate, and I think it's also very unhelpful at the moment. We are living in complex and challenging times. We are facing some very difficult circumstances. We have climate change, global pandemics, and Donald Trump. And so I think that it's really important that all kinds of thinkers are thinking together, using their creative power, their creative tools to come up with some solutions. So I'm a curator and the director of a gallery, and I dropped out of high school biology because it was hard and a little bit icky. So I mostly just really love art. So I'm just going to look at some examples of artists that perhaps articulate some of these ideas. Now, so I've sort of, I guess, focused on 4 ideas that articulate the whole. The first is that artists are scientists, so just completely agreeing with James, which once again I'm really disappointed in. And I'm also going to skip Da Vinci because we've spoken about him. And I mean, he is I guess, a obvious choice because he is the quintessential Renaissance man. I'm just dropping my notes all over the place. Okay, but another example is Maria Sibylla Merian, 1647 to 1717, and she was a Swiss naturalist and artist living and working in the 17th century. She excelled in both endeavours. One of her principal claims to fame is that she is one of the first naturalists to have studied insects. She recorded and illustrated the life cycles of 186 insect species and documented the nature of metamorphosis. She also discovered unknown animals and insects, and her classification of butterflies and moths is still used today. But before her scientific investigations, Merian first earned acclaim as a botanical artist, and you can see examples of her work here, and published 3 volumes, each of 12 illustrated plates of flowers in 1675. And then we have Samuel Morse, who of course is most well known for being the inventor of Morse code. He was a bit of a maths nerd, but before being a maths nerd, he trained under Benjamin West at London's Royal Academy of the Arts and co-founded the National Academy of Design in Manhattan. His large-scale neoclassical paintings of myth and history scenes were his passion, and this is his most famous work, which is the Monumental Gallery of the Louvre, and it measures an impressive 6 by 9 feet. I don't know why that detail is important, but I'll let you know anyway. Okay, so the next idea is that artists work with scientists and scientific methods and materials. And now we move on to some more contemporary art. So this is an Australian artist, Svenja Kratz, who is a beautiful artist and a friend of mine as well. This is self-portrait number 2, Site of Infection. And it consists of a wax cast of the artist's bust, which is rendered in a style reminiscent of classical depiction of female gods, and it emits a vapor containing the artist's DNA. So the work considers viral infection as a potential mechanism of obtaining immortality and securing an ongoing genetic legacy. More specifically, the artist proposes that by genetically engineering viruses to include fragments of her genetic code, it may be possible to infect an organism and have the virus reproduce the genetic material within the selected host. So this work was made pre-COVID-19. And she probably would have difficulty showing it today. But Svenja has a long ongoing practice where she works with DNA and cells, and very specifically works in labs with scientists creating these works. This is Tash Bates. Beautiful lace-like or wallpaper-like looking work. This work is encased in a series of acrylic boxes, and it's living Candida albicans, which grows in a pattern adapted from the first drawing of the organism by Charles Philip Robin in 1853. So it's reminiscent of those popular on the wallpaper of parlours and art galleries in Europe at the time. So the Candida grows on blood agar, a nutrient source that contains the blood of the human artist. The acrylic containment frames the artwork as an unstill life and minimizes the risk of contamination or infection. Within this containment, the living Candida escapes the constraints of patterning during the exhibition, disrupting attempts to discipline it. So once again, amazing research goes into this work, using scientific methods, but also injecting artistic style, artistic history and research into the work. And then Neil Harbison, who is a very cool guy, and in fact, he is the first legally recognized human cyborg. But he started his life out as a musician, and now we would recognize him as a contemporary artist. He was born with complete color blindness. And although he considered his condition to be an asset, he wished to understand colors and sight in depth. So he had a sensor implanted into his brain that enables him to translate wavelengths into sounds in his skull. So the British government has officially named him the world's first cyborg. It's on his passport and everything. So the sensor he designed captures wavelengths and turns them into vibrations. So Harbison then experiences the vibrations and sounds. So in layman's terms, Harbison has been hearing visible and invisible lights for the past 13 years. And he looks cool doing it. Damn cool. So he walks around with that all the time. That's him now, which is kind of amazing. Okay, so the third idea is that artists transform scientific information into knowledge. So I guess one of the things that we in contemporary society are currently faced with is boundless generation and collection of data. So it's an almost immeasurable act. So be it weather or transport data sets published by government agencies, or the individual and interpersonal data generated by our digital interactions, a server somewhere is collating huge amounts of information. But with the rise of this digital data phenomenon comes questions of comprehension, purpose, ownership, and translation. And without mediation, digital data is an immense abstract list of text and numbers. And in this abstracted form, data sets become detached from circumstances of their creation. And so therefore, artists can play a really important role in actually translating this information into something that is knowable, either through things like data visualization. So this is Fernanda Viegas and Martin Waterberg's wind map. And so this collects in real time a heap of weather data across America. And if you actually go to the website, and the link is up at the top, you can see how the wind moves over America at any one time. And it's a beautiful visualization. So it's something that's beautiful to look at. And they talk about themselves, or they talk about this work as saying, as technologists, we ask, can visualization help people think collectively? Can visualization move beyond numbers into the realm of words and images? As artists, we seek the joy of revelation. Can visualization tell never before told stories? Can it uncover truths about color, memory, and sensuality? So as I said, this work, the wind map, shows the delicate traces of wind flowing over the US in real time using weather data. And although it was made as a wind map, on their website they talk about the fact that it's also been used for all kinds of unexpected things. Bird watchers have tracked migration patterns, bicyclists have planned their trips, and apparently conspiracy theorists have used it to track mysterious chemicals in the air. So yeah, it just, art can be used for all kinds of things. The next artist is Aaron Copland, and this is a video, Ian, I don't know if, it might play. Do I press something again to play it? What? Oh, yeah. Okay, so we'll see if that plays. So this is Aaron Copland, who is a very well-known data visualization artist, and this is his work, Flight Patterns, which expresses the paths of air traffic over North America, visualized in color and form. And it's a beautiful work. Once again, it's very meditative, it's very artistic, but you also get a real sense of the immensity of these flight patterns and how complex of a system this actually is. So I, once again, check out his website and have a look at this work in more detail. And then back to the weather, this is my Mitchell Whitelaw, and I actually have a real-life version of this work in my bag, if anyone wants to come see it later. And this is called Data Cup, and it uses design software and 3D printing to capture weather data over a period of time. So the Data Cup that I have is 100 years of Brisbane rainfall, and so you can hold in your hand all of this information, and by running your fingers over the ridges and the dips, you get a sense of the cyclical nature of weather. You can see where extreme weatherfall has happened, where there's drought, and so it's a really interesting and sensorial way of understanding this information that would be very difficult to understand just by looking at a list of statistics. And the fourth and last idea is that artists push the boundaries of scientific research to ask more questions. So obviously scientists are asking lots of questions, but artists ask even more questions. Sometimes they're asking questions that perhaps didn't need to be asked, but that's okay. So this is Stellark. Some of you may know Stellark. He is a very important and famous Australian artist. And in the 80s, he was well known for these suspension performances, where he would embed hooks into his own flesh and then suspend for a period of time. But he is also the artist that decided to grow a third ear on his forearm and underwent a number of surgical procedures to affix the ear, which was partially created out of biocompatible material and partially cell-grown to his arm. And this ear can actually transmit the sounds that it hears. So Stellark says of the work, "The body now performs beyond the boundaries of its skin and beyond the local space that it occupies. It can project its physical presence elsewhere. So the notion of single agency is undermined, or at least made more problematic. The body becomes a nexus or a node of collaborating agents and are not simply separated or excluded because of the boundary of our skin or of having to be in proximity. So we experience remote bodies, and we have these remote bodies invading, inhabiting, and emanating from the architecture of our bodies, expressed by the movements and sounds prompted by remote agents." So, I mean, this is an amazing work, and if you meet Stellark, he will let you talk to the ear, which is a pretty singular experience that one can have. And this is Lauren McCarthy, who's an American artist, and this is her work, Tools for Improved Social Interacting, the Happiness Hat. So in this work, she's exploring the world of wearable technologies. So these devices collect data about us, how many steps we take, how often we exercise, our heart rate, etc., and promise to assist us to become better versions of ourselves. For example, I wear a Fitbit, and every hour, 10 minutes before the hour finishes, it kind of buzzes and tells me how many more steps I should take to achieve the right level of movement during the day. And then I go and take those steps and it buzzes again to reward me. And it is amazing how well this thing is training me. You will often see me walking around the gallery for no reason except to get that little buzz on my wrist. So Lauren takes this to a new place, questioning, I suppose, how far we might take some of these prompting technologies. And the happiness focuses on social cues to make one a more amiable person. So an enclosed bend sensor attached to the cheek measures the size of your smile. And if it senses that you aren't smiling, it shoves a metal spike into the back of your head until you do, to teach you that you should smile all the time. So this is amazing. And then the last artist and work that I'm going to talk about is Sarah van Soensbach. And she interrogates how technology creates inescapable noise in our lives. So while Soensbach is an avid user of Twitter, Instagram, and other platforms, she admits to feeling that something has been lost in their use or their overuse. And she sees the online world as another type of public space. And so has typically gone about arranging this space, deciding what she does and doesn't want to hear. And before being an artist, Van Soensbach was an architect. So she is very interested in space and how space is being used. So this gave birth to the Faraday bag, a simple shoulder bag, which I think is, it's just on the left. The Faraday bag, which is a simple shoulder bag made from silver-plated fabric that blocks electric magnetic signals. So essentially you put your mobile phone in there and it no longer works. It can't get a signal. You're no longer connected to the network. And once again, I actually have this bag in my bag, so if you want to see it, you can come have a look at it. And then this concept was pushed further in her work, Anti-Drone Tent, which is a small construction of emergency blankets that block thermal infrared sensing, making it invisible to drones, which, perhaps more and more is something that we all might want to get in on. And so the art of Van Soensbach is in constant dialogue with emerging technologies, trying to retain slivers of silence within our technological world. So these are just some examples, I guess, of how art and science play together and how interesting ideas emerge from that convergence. I think it's a very natural convergence. I think we need to promote it, encourage it, support it as much as possible through collaborations and through that understanding that realistically it's all just people thinking about questions and coming up with ideas. And just because it felt cool at the time, and because the title of the show is Art versus Science, I thought we'd finish with Art versus Science's version of Magic Fountain from 2010 to play me out as I hand back over to James.
There was a fountain, but it wasn't just any fountain.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to interrupt Art versus Science.
It was a fountain of light.
Thank you, Rachel. And for our final speaker, this can be your walk-on song like you're a boxer or something. Please welcome from the University of New England, parasitologist, artist, Monster Girls fanatic, Dr. Tommy Leon. Come on, Tommy.
Magic Fountain.
Hey gang, how's it going? Oh, this is pretty bright. Should put my sunglasses on. Okay, so as James has already introduced, my name is Dr. Tommy Long. I'm a lecturer at University of New England, and seeing how everyone's showing off their art, I wasn't going to mention it, but those two things, I actually drew them. So anyway, for today's talk, this is actually not my first time on this whole Science in the Club rodeo. About 2 years ago, I was actually invited to give a talk about parasite body snatchers, and specifically parasites in real life versus the parasites I have found in science fiction. And spoiler alert, that talk is online, and basically my verdict was that the ones in science fiction and movies are comparatively boring compared with the real thing. So it's pretty obvious that judging from this, you probably have some assumptions about what I'm going to be talking about today. That's right, I'm going to be talking about paleo art and dinosaur illustrations and how they are actually an embodiment of scientific ideas, artistic sensibility, as well as prevailing societal views at the time of the creation. So I'm actually going to be talking about how dinosaur illustration throughout the ages provides us with a snapshot of those things. So most of you who keeps up with science news would have come across, say, stories like this once every few months, in some cases once every few weeks, of some new dinosaur discovery found somewhere near or somewhere far, and usually they'll be accompanied by a picture like this. This would have been done by a paleo artist of how that animal would have looked like in life. And as for most people, that is the extent to which they would engage that story. They'll see the headline, go, oh, new dinosaur. This is how this new dinosaur looks like. And that becomes the definitive image of how that animal looks like in the person's mind. However, if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find that some of these reconstructions could be based from anything from a complete skeleton all the way down to literally just a few teeth. So when you see one of these stories and you see, oh, cool dinosaur, when you look at the actual story, it could be that that entire dinosaur is extrapolated upon just based on a few scraps of bones. So obviously, many of these illustrations aren't just a one-to-one representation of what was actually found. There's a great deal of not just the fossil material themselves determining how the dinosaur looked like, but there's also a great deal of scientific interpretation that goes into reconstructing one of these particular animals. And as new scientific evidence, new fossil material begin to be discovered, that image of that particular animal can also change, and in some cases, quite radically. And one of the best examples of that is with Iguanodon, which was one of the first species of dinosaurs ever to be described or discovered. When Iguanodon was initially discovered, dinosaurs weren't really known as a thing. Paleontology didn't really exist as a field. And so when it was found by Gideon Mantell and his wife, it was just literally just a few scraps of fossil. It was a handful of teeth as well as this kind of spiky, bony structure that they found. And so there wasn't really much to go on. And the way that they went about extrapolating what this animal might have been was pretty much in the same manner that paleontologists continue to do today, which is to compare the fossil remains with that of known organisms. Now, of course, paleontologists have a wide range of dinosaurs to compare their fossil bones with, but back then, dinosaurs weren't a thing. So the closest thing to what they actually found were iguana teeth. So basically, they found kind of teeth that resembled giant version of iguana teeth. And iguana, for those who don't know, are large lizards that are herbivorous. And so based upon that, the reconstruction of Iguanodon initially looked like this, which was an elephant-sized herbivorous reptile. To some extent, this particular reconstruction is actually correct. Iguanodon was an elephant-sized herbivorous reptile, but a few decades after the initial discovery of those teeth and that bony structure, whole skeleton and complete skeletons of Iguanodon were discovered in a Belgian mine. And it turns out that it actually looked like this. So the details were changed. Yes, it was about the size of an elephant. Yes, it was a herbivore, except that it didn't look like a ginormous iguana. So this particular reconstruction was done by a paleontologist called Dollo. And he looked at the long hind limbs of Iguanodon and based it, basically, the reconstruction on that of cassowaries and kangaroo. Hence why Iguanodon in this particular image looks like some kind of reptilian kangaroo that is also working part-time as an inspirational life coach, putting the thumbs up all the time. There was a kind of a subsequent re-examination of that particular material by a paleontologist called Dr. David Norman in the 1980s, and he determined that in order for Iguanodon to pose in that particular way, it would have broken its tail. Iguanodon's tail was relatively stiff with various ossified elements and would have been held out straight. And so the more contemporary, modern version of iguanodon actually look more like this. So this is the usual narrative of how a dinosaur or how a dinosaur looked like change over the ages. As new scientific interpretation and evidence come about, new fossil materials supplement the pre-existing material, and that image of the dinosaur get updated. However, there's a little bit more to it than that in terms of determining how a dinosaur looked like. If you're someone who's looked at enough of these paleo art, you start noticing something known as paleotropes, which are certain cliches and stylistic choices that seem to repeat in certain types of animals, even though there is no real good reason for those things existing or against them existing. So for example, you might see image of mosasaurs, which are a Cretaceous marine reptile, which were reconstructed with a frill on its back, even though there's no frill on its back. There's a sauropod dinosaur called Barosaurus that seemed to always be reconstructed with its long neck hanging in this kind of parabolic manner. There's also certain animals or certain dinosaurs that associate with a particular color, even though that initial color was completely guesswork. And usually that's because a particularly influential paleo artist decided to reconstruct that animal in that particular manner, and everyone else that came afterwards go, okay, well, we'll just do it that way. Why does it have a blue face? It does, okay? So artistic style often can also determine how an animal looks like, especially for an animal that no one has ever actually seen. But all of those exist within a prevailing societal context. Artists are people, scientists are also people as well. And I'm sure most of you would accept that prevailing cultural and societal view would influence things like artistic style. You can see social movement and social changes and art movement accompanying those social changes. However, society also influences scientific interpretation as well. As much as science is supposed to be an impartial and objective process, and is designed to be so, scientists too live in a society, and they are also influenced by the views of society when they examine scientific evidence. So for much of the 20th century, from the late 19th century to up until about 1970s, this was the prevailing image of how a dinosaur looked like. This particular iconic painting was done by a highly influential paleo artist, Charles R. Knight, and I'm sure you probably would have seen variation of something like this, of a pair of these sauropod dinosaurs kind of lounging around in swamps. So the modern contemporary views of what sauropods actually were, which were these long-necked, building-sized dinosaurs, would have been that they spent most of the time walking around on dry land. But for much of the 20th century, it was thought that these animals would have spent most of the time in water. And that was the reason for that is actually due to kind of the way that scientists view dinosaurs at the time. Because you see, even though evolution by natural selection by Charles Darwin has been widely accepted as the scientific consensus, and as much as scientists spoke in the language of evolution, the way that they thought about life on Earth is still very much based upon this kind of ladder of life thinking, of more primitive versus advanced life form, of higher versus lower life form, even though that's totally not how evolution works. And so to them, they believe in the inherent superiority of mammals, and at the peak of evolution or the pinnacle of evolution is none other than that of the English gentleman. And so the reason for, how do they reconcile or rationalize the existence of dinosaurs, these ginormous beasts which lived for over 100 million years on the surface of the Earth? And they came to the conclusion that basically dinosaurs were kind of these dim-witted creatures that were maladapted to the environment, and they were only hanging on simply because the mammals weren't there to overthrow them. And at the time, some of the hypotheses that were proposed for why dinosaurs went extinct were actually, on hindsight, quite hilarious, even though they were taken seriously by various groups of people at the time. They include things like, they all tend to have a kind of a moralistic kind of a streak, ranging from things like the mammals ate all the eggs, to things like the dinosaurs became too dumb to live, which is totally not how biology works. There are plenty of life forms out there that could survive with very minimal brain matter. Insert your favorite political joke here. And also, In some cases, larger brain actually can be a liability. And in addition to that, another rather strange hypothesis that was proposed was that the dinosaur became too decadent. And the context for that is that during the Cretaceous period leading up to the extinction of the non-avian dinosaur, there were these duck-billed dinosaurs and horned dinosaurs that were evolving all these elaborate head ornaments, like all kinds of horns and frills. And many of these English gentlemen scientists thought that these dinosaurs were becoming too decadent, and that's why they died out. It probably says a lot more about the hang-up of those particular scientists rather than actually have any basis, because you notice that they all focus on the dinosaur. And what many people might not quite realize is that at the end of the Cretaceous period, it wasn't just the dinosaurs that went extinct. There were a whole lot of other marine reptiles, ammonites, entire groups of birds and mammals that also went extinct alongside with the dinosaurs. And so because of that, they came to believe that these sauropod dinosaurs, the only way they could live, these dim-witted, slovenly beasts, is by immersing themselves in water, because they're so maladapted, they cannot possibly support themselves on dry land, even though their anatomy seems to indicate that to be the case. So they often reconstruct them being immersed in all this water. Now, here's a little bit of, biology and anatomy lesson. When you look at large animals that actually spend extended periods of time in water or have a semi-aquatic lifestyle, such as hippopotamus, you would notice that the cross-section are actually quite rotund. They're almost barrel-shaped. In addition to that, they would also have very splayed foot pads as to not sink into the mud, and also provide purchase when they swing through the water. When you look at the anatomy of a sauropod dinosaur, despite how large they are, their cross-sections are actually quite narrow and have these very straight, almost column-like legs that ends in very narrow foot pad. So pretty much the opposite of what you would see in a large aquatic animal. Now, the sauropod skeleton that the paleontologists looked at back then are the same as the one that the scientists and paleontologists look at now. What changed was actually their societal views, because they were used to thinking of these things as being inherently inferior animals, and so all the ideas that they had for how they live is made with the assumption that, well, they are not as good at living as the fantastic mammals and of course us humans, because we're the pinnacle of creation, evolution. They were still stuck in that particular way. And so up until about the 1970s, this was still largely the view of dinosaurs as being these big, dumb, cold-blooded beasts. Right about the 1960s and the 70s, the United States were undergoing certain societal changes. The new generation of young people were questioning the existing status quo as well as challenging it. You see the rise of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And it's within this particular societal environment that you have a new group of paleontologists that were questioning the status quo of dinosaurs being these inferior beasts. This led to a scientific movement that was known as the dinosaur renaissance. And the person who spearheaded this movement was a paleontologist called Robert Bakker. And these are some of the sketches of dinosaur by Robert Bakker. To Bakker, these dinosaurs were not these slovenly, dumb, dim-witted beasts that were waiting for the mammals to come and overthrow them. They were well-adapted, active, warm-blooded creatures that were the dominant terrestrial megafauna on the surface of the planet for over 100 million years. And the only reason why the mammals got to be where we are now is because about 65 million years ago, a giant space rock the size of a mountain kept crashing out of the sky at about 58 times the speed of sound, slamming into the Yucatan Peninsula and generating an explosion that released 500 times more energy than the combined nuclear arsenal of the entire world at the peak of the Cold War. There was nothing in evolution that could possibly prepare you for such a world-ending event, especially seeing how that ginormous explosion was only the start of the disaster. The Earth plunged into a deep, dark winter for many centuries after that, stopping photosynthesis and most life process. You can't evolve your way out of this. The only way you could possibly survive is via what Stephen Jay Gould would call luck. in that you would have evolved features that allow you to survive such an event. But the reason why you evolved those features had nothing to do with predicting a world-ending event in the first place. So he popularized this idea in a book called The Dinosaur Heresies, a book which would have any self-respecting dinosaur nerd would have some passing familiarity with. And this particular sketch is that he did of Deinonychus. Deinonychus was a large relative of a name that I'm sure many people would be familiar with, Velociraptor. Here is an animal that is the antithesis of that swamp-dwelling, lumbering brontosaurus. This was very clearly an active, agile animal, possibly even quite intelligent as well. And it's this particular image of dinosaurs as these very active and well-adapted animal that were popularized in a little film that you might have heard of called Jurassic Park, which came out in 1993. Jurassic Park, when it came out, presented dinosaurs in a way that has never been presented before on the big screen. And the image that it presented was at the time the most scientifically up-to-date somewhat of how scientists thought these animals might have looked like and behaved. And so it's actually quite ironic that in the almost 30 years since Jurassic Park came out and the science of dinosaur and what scientists' image of dinosaur has moved on, the film franchise has not. The latest Jurassic World films still have dinosaurs that look like that, even though they are hopelessly out of date. So I found it quite ironic that the Jurassic film franchise, when it initially came out, played an extremely major role in popularizing the public acceptance of a scientifically up-to-date view of dinosaurs, and now has become the very opposite and is holding back the public acceptance of a more up-to-date view of how dinosaurs look like. And the thing is that back in the pre-dinosaur Renaissance era, it's not as if no one actually, or no scientists actually thought of dinosaurs as being these active animals. For example, Charles R. Knight, who did that painting of the brontosaurus dwelling in swamp, he also did this particular painting called Leaping Laelaps of a pair of Dryptosaurus, which were ancestral relative of Tyrannosaurus. These were large theropods that grew up to about 6 meters long. And he depicted them in this rather playful way that is almost reminiscent of a pair of cats. In fact, I suspect that that was probably his inspiration for this particular painting. And Thomas Huxley, who was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, he was one of the first scientists to point out the possible evolutionary connections between dinosaurs and birds. But the ideas, the time was not prepared for them. The society was not prepared for those particular ideas. And they went on for many decades believing dinosaurs to be these lumbering beasts. So in the field of paleo art and dinosaur art in general, there is a new art movement going on that had been colloquially called the All Yesterdays movement, which was named after a book that came out to popularize this particular idea. And the All Yesterdays movement involved recognizing that there is only so much that you could tell from the fossil of a particular animal. For example, if you look at the skeleton of an owl or a cat or a koala or sperm whale, if you have no idea what mammals or birds are, if you were to try to reconstruct the animal, the cat, the owl, the koala, or the sperm whale based upon skeleton, I can guarantee you that what you actually reconstruct will look very different from how those animals look like in life. So this All Yesterdays movement is the recognition of there are certain things that are not present in the fossil record. The picture that you reconstruct of these animals are probably going to be wrong regardless. And this particular painting by Brian Eng was trying to make that particular point. He basically is saying that, okay, if you be really conservative and reconstruct your dinosaur in a way that only stick to what has been preserved in the fossil, you are going to be wrong because there are things that don't get preserved in fossils. Or, as long as your speculation is based upon good biological and zoological science, you can add a bit of speculation to your reconstruction, and it could be interesting and wrong, but it might spur on some scientists to test new hypotheses about these particular animals. And so the All Yesterdays movement and the art is exemplified by the use of more vibrant colors, because vibrant colors are found in living dinosaurs, i.e. the birds. as well as depicting these animals in the a more naturalistic setting, surrounded by paying more attention to their surrounding environment and the paleo environment that they would have existed in, as well as depicting the animal as engaging in activities other than just trying to fight or eat each other, as many of the older paleo art tend to do, because even T-Rex sometimes gets a little bit amorous, and having animals that behave in animal kind of way, in an animalistic way. And I don't mean that by being all ragey and stuff, but animals sometimes do boring things. It's okay to depict dinosaurs doing boring things like sleeping, for example. And so this is kind of the new wave of art that is, kind of works in synergy with many scientists. And this new movement also brings with it many wider range of artists from a wider range of background that have their own perspective to contribute about these extinct animals, not just dinosaurs, but also other extinct animals as well. And so dinosaur illustration kind of serves as a time capsule of scientific ideas, artistic sensibility, as well as prevailing societal views. And this kind of prevailing societal view sometimes is necessary to provide context to fully appreciate what an illustration actually represents. So as a kind of a final note, I want to talk a little bit about this particular illustration, which was done by the artist Gregory S. Paul for his book, Predatory Dinosaur of the World, which came out in 1988. The title of this particular illustration is called What Happens When Apatosaurus ajax Seeks Aquatic Refuge from Allosaurus fragilis. Now, on the surface of it, it would seem like this is a perfectly good reconstruction of those species of animal. It was very up-to-date and scientifically accurate for its particular time. Apatosaurus and Allosaurus existed in the Morrison Formation in North America during the Jurassic. They lived alongside each other. Allosaurus was the apex predator of that ecosystem, so it would have hunted after Apatosaurus. So this kind of a interaction could have possibly taken place. So, a good, plausible reconstruction of these two species of animal. At least that's what it seems. At the face of it, yes, it is a scientifically accurate reconstruction of those particular two species of animal, but it is actually also a big paleontological in-joke. It is what some of us who are extremely online would call a shitpost, made in visual form. Because you see, back in the pre-dinosaur Renaissance era, where you have those swamp-dwelling sauropod dinosaurs, it was commonly believed that sauropod dinosaurs escaped from the predators by fleeing into the water. Never mind that they had these powerful tails that could break the neck of an allosaur with a single flick, or even with just a single kick from one of its ginormous legs. Back then people believed that these particular giant, magnificent beasts were very, very passive, and so they would have slinked away in the water to escape from the predator. And what Gregory S. Paul the point that he was trying to make was that, well, if it did that, Allosaurus would have gone after it anyway. Therefore, your idea is dumb. So this is actually a response to a loaded question from back in the day. And so sometimes, basically, the TL didn't watch it section of this particular talk is that in order to appreciate both scientific ideas and art, and of course art that are based upon scientific ideas, sometimes you need to be aware of the societal context under which they are both created. And that's pretty much what I have to talk about with dinosaur illustration for today.
All right. Question number 1. Which of the following artists does not share the name with the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle? Watch me nail the pronunciation on these. A. Leonardo da Vinci. B. Sandro Botticelli. C. Donato di Niccolò di Beto Bardi. D. Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni. You can just write A, B, C, or D. You don't have to write the whole name for each of these. All right, nice quick grind. Question number 2. Which member of music group Queen is an astrophysicist? This was from my talk, which I'm sure you were all paying wonderful attention to. So I assume we'll get 100% on this one. A. Freddie Mercury, B. Roger Taylor, C. Brian May, D. John Deacon. All right, question number 3. Which performance artist suspended himself from hooks in his skin? I feel like there should have been a trigger warning with these pictures, Rachel. I feel like this skin hooks made me go a bit funny. It was just a one-word name, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's keep it moving. Question number 4. Which 17th century physicist first used a prism to determine the properties of light and color? If you can just write his surname, if that helps, I'll accept surnames only. 17th century was too long ago. Not in recent memory. All right. According to Goodrich, in 1859, what is this dinosaur called? This is the one that doesn't look like this anymore. All right, question number 6. Which British ornithologist and artist documented Australian birds and has a colourful finch named in his honour? That's the finch. If you know the name of the finch, you can probably guess the name. And I heard someone just say it really loudly, so you get All right, question number 7. Which of the following did Leonardo da Vinci not design? Oh, it's a big multiple choice. A. Helicopter. B. Perpetual motion machine. C. Self-propelled cart. D. Parachute. E. Bicycle. F. Automaton/robot. Or G. Machine gun. You also did not design Mr. Nebels, remember? That's not an option in the question there. All right, I'm going to keep it moving. Question number 8. All right, in RGB, red, green, blue color palette, what color is created with the following ratio? 166 reds, 50 greens, 155 blues. It's a very complexly worded question for something that is actually quite simple. If we think about it. All right, question number 9. UV paint. Some UV paints will glow under a black light. If you've ever been to a foam party, you may have seen this happen. What's the scientific term for the glowing effect? Got any black lights in your kit, Ian? Get it pumping? And final question. What's the name given to the diffraction of light across a surface that creates color without a pigment? You can see it here in a picture of this oil slick. We see it in things like bird feathers, beetle exoskeletons, all sorts of stuff.
But I think anyone who works in science and art and both are people who are like inherently curious. And the curiosity is the thing that drives them to create things, whether like, as James said, like knowledge or art. And I think mostly, I guess science tells you an approximation of like how reality is or is supposed to be, whereas arts kind of reach into kind of more subjective things, like things that science can't really, depict. And I think any good piece of art should evoke some kind of a reaction from someone. you could place value on whether that's a good reaction or bad reaction. But at the end of the day, I think any successful piece of art is one that makes someone feel something, so to speak. So, yeah.
Yes?
Thanks, Rachel.
Succinct.
I actually think, Tommy, you made a really good point when talking about the responsibility that the Jurassic Park films have, because we have all these wonderful discoveries coming out of paleontology labs, but the impact that any piece of science communication can have sort of pales into comparison as to what a single Jurassic Park film can have.
Yeah, I actually have a kind of a, I guess, personal insight into this kind of how that affects the audience and stuff like that, simply because I'm a dinosaur fan, so to speak. Because the moment that, the way that I saw the Jurassic film franchise evolving, so to speak, is that they've gone from films that depicted dinosaurs to films that depicted monsters. Because you will notice, especially with some of the more recent movies, the dinosaurs in those films do not act like real animals. They would do things that real animals would not do, such as plunging the face into a streaming waterfall of lava. Like those are all, murder monster things, but they're not dinosaur things. Real animals would do things like that. And I guess the moment that the Jurassic films decided that it's not going to be presenting dinosaurs but presenting monsters, that means that it kind of switched categories in my head. And the dinosaurs that are depicted in the Jurassic films actually makes pretty poor and boring monsters. If I want to watch a monster movie, I have things like, Pacific Rim, the first one, not the second one, but like the first one, and many other films that have far more interesting looking monsters. And the ironic thing that I think is that if they were to update how dinosaurs actually look like based upon the most recent science, you'll find that these dinosaurs look even more flamboyant and more, I guess, outlandish and ridiculous than people had imagined them back in the 90s. So ironically enough, by stop being a dinosaur movie and just merely being a kind of, survival horror monster movie, yeah.
Other philosophical thing is, what is the difference, when do you cross from, what is art and what is just entertainment?
Well, I would argue that entertainment is a type of art. It's just that, what is, in the original version of the talk, I originally had this slide that is like art created in service of whatever. So in this case, art created in service of science for those particular paleo reconstructions. But it's just kind of different forms of art, whether you're talking about like pop art or art paid, made to create money. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not art. It's just that art made for different means, and sometimes you can have things that are made for purely commercial purposes that nevertheless for some kind of like societal impact, such as with Jurassic Park. They didn't make Jurassic Park just to popularize dinosaurs. They made it to make a lot of money, So art can, regardless of what it was original purpose was made for, still it is art, no matter what kind of art you want to call it.
Anyone else want to jump in? Yes.
Sorry. Obviously, paleo art's come a long way from like the big dumb creatures to what we see nowadays. I think a term that's used a lot nowadays, though, shrink wrapping, in terms of.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to make this like a 50-minute long lecture on the history of development of paleo art, but yeah, I am aware of shrink wrapping. And shrink wrapping is actually something that I guess the whole All Yesterday's movement is also, in a way, targeting or like kind of in response to, because shrink wrapping, for those who don't know, is where you have a reconstruction of an animal that is basically purely based upon the skeletal element, and the reconstruction is just like a little bit of flesh and then a bit of like the skin wrapped around it. And sometimes you'll lead to phenomena where the skeletal element shows through the skin, hence the whole shrink wrapping term.
Definitely prominent in dinosaurs, that's for sure.
Yeah. So you got like some of the, you'll see the flank of a sauropod dinosaur, like a brontosaurus, and then you'll see like outlines of the rib cage. It looks like the dinosaur has been starving or something like that. And that is often the case with these kind of shrink-wrapped dinosaur. And that is something that the All Yesterday's movement is also, I guess, tackling as well, because to say like, look, you can't just, chuck some meat and then chuck some skin onto a dinosaur skeleton and call it a day, which is what a lot of these kind of shrink-wrapped dinosaurs actually look like. So yeah, that is like one out of like probably a dozen different little paleo art thing that I couldn't really talk about because of limited time. But my talk was actually based on a lecture that I give for a first year zoology unit. So I do talk a little bit more about like paleo reconstructions and the history and artistic movement within that particular field for that.
It's just such a dramatic flip from like the big like sauropods who couldn't get out of water to like now these just like, especially in, I think I see in horned dinosaurs a lot, like it's so prominent in the faces and that, like they're so drawn and everything, and just how we got from there to there.
Yeah. And so much of it is because of like people's mentality as well, because like I said, brachiosaur, when it was discovered back in around about 1920s, it's the still same brachiosaur skeleton as what we have now. It's just people looked at them in a different way, and the switch was just recognizing that, oh, they weren't big dumb reptiles and were not all that. I think one thing that I forgot to mention was that mammals actually evolved initially at the same time as when the first dinosaurs evolved during the Triassic period. So when the end Triassic mass extinction event happened, there was all kinds of ecological niches that was available for any group of animal to evolve to fill them. Dinosaurs won. They filled up all these ecological niches, and the mammals basically spent the next 160 million years slinking around in the shadows of the dinosaurs, growing no larger than the size of a badger until that ginormous rock came out of the sky when it did. So kind of recognizing that, oh wait, these things like mammals aren't inherently superior, and the dinosaurs are still around today. There are over 10,000 species that are flying around over the place. So they are still continuing to be a really successful group. They just look different from the way they did back then.
Thank you.
I'd like to try and run a little philosophy past you, which essentially tries to divide science, religion and art by an understanding of truth. Now, truth does not actually exist. It's not available to us. But science makes a genuine attempt to determine it in those fields, in those places where truth actually exists, is achievable. If we look at religion, truth is important. How people work together and some sort of shared belief is important, but the truth of the beliefs will never be determined. Whereas in art, truth doesn't matter. It doesn't really, if we have a list of artworks one generation and we order them, and then another generation will order them in totally different order. And where that agrees with Julie, is that most of what motivates people is not truth. And if Trump has taught us one thing, you don't have to be telling the truth to get people to believe you and to move you. And art is about understanding what people believe and why they believe it, so that you can get acceptance from those beliefs. Can you concur with that at all or not? Or would you like to please rebut it?
I guess people like to believe, they like to believe that what they believe is the truth. They want their truths to be the truths,
They don't have any basis to do that.
Well, the thing is that even people who are scientists are also, like I said, scientists. They're people. They live in a society, and you will find that scientists do not equally apply their scientific process to everything in their lives. That's why sometimes you have Nobel Prize winners that believe some really wacky ideas that have no basis in reality whatsoever. But scientists are humans. Like, I have been in the field of academia to not be so reverential towards like the title of someone. What matters more is what they actually say and what they actually do, rather than what their title actually supposedly, what kind of superpower bestowed them with because of that particular title. So.
Historically used to justify some horrible things like social Darwinism,
Yep.
eugenics, and all those things were given.
Can I also butt in and ask Rachel? There's one little phrase in there in that question that in art, truth doesn't matter. Comment, please.
I mean, I think it depends on the art. And what that art is trying to do. I mean, I think that there are some artists that are very much trying to communicate some sense of their own truth and their own story, understanding that of course, is biased and not necessarily completely embedded within facts as scientists might see them. But once again, I think that there are a lot of artists who, do look at facts, do look at rigorous research within their work, and so it can be backed up with, some of the, some of that process that you might see in the scientific process as well. I think within my talk, we see a number of artists who are using that scientific methodology within their work, and then I think in some artwork the truth isn't important. It isn't what the artist is going for, and it might be more about ideas or imagination or a whole range of other things. So I think that, when you're talking about art, as you were saying, it's so broad. It can be so many things. It can be completely frivolous. It can be incredibly academic and rigorous, and everything in between. So I think, if we wanted to debate that as an idea, give me a minute and I'll come back with some artwork that I think, perhaps suggests the other.
Just something to add to that. You might want to look up a concept called death of the author. Death of the author. So this is in relation to literature work, or actually this applies to any other creative art in general. In terms of like how much it matters what the creator's intention is versus what the viewers or the audience interpretation of that piece of art. And there's a lot of debate around the idea of the death of the author, but that kind of gets at something about art and like what you were saying about different art being arranged differently throughout the ages and stuff like that. The interaction between the creator's intention versus what the audience, how they interpret their piece of art. And for most of my art, I actually kind of encourage and quite like other people's interpretation of my art, because I have an idea of what it actually means, but I want to see what people kind of, how they react when they see my art.
And isn't the fact that the artwork can be successful even though the interpretations of it can be as many as the number of people who've seen it, demonstrate that truth is not relevant?
It kind of depends on what you mean by successful, I guess, in terms of like artwork. Is it,
Someone looks at it and they say, yes, I like that. Well, that does something.
Yeah. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that they like it. There could be artwork that are extremely successful but like evoke a really bad reaction from people as well, like extremely controversial artwork. And those are artwork that become like remembered because they are extremely controversial as well. So you could say they're successful that way.
In my opinion, the only kind of unsuccessful art are the works that make you think or feel nothing. Ambiguity towards art, I think, is unsuccessful. But if you hate it, you love it. If you think about something, you feel something, then that's all good.
I'm going to jump in simply because we're running out of time and we have to get things moving on. But as a quick summary before you guys disappear, just in case you're wondering, Sandro Botticelli does not share his name with a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. Brian May is an astrophysicist. Stellark hung himself from hooks in his skin. Isaac Newton was the guy that determined the properties of light and color using a prism. Iguanodon was the dinosaur we saw. John Gould was the ornithologist who documented Australian birds. Leonardo da Vinci did not have a crack at designing a bicycle. The color made by 166 reds, 50 greens, and 155 blues is just purple. Blue and red, you stick them together, you get purple. UV paints glowing under a black light is fluorescence, and the structural colors are called iridescence. And our trivia winner, with a grand, big, whopping 7 points, Sitacosaurus. Congratulations. You have no idea how long I stared at that name going, what the hell does that say? Guys, I have to wrap it up. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks to the Wicklow for having us and Inspiring Australia for putting this event on. Can I get you all to join me one more time in thanking our speakers, Tommy Long, Rachel Parsons, me too, I guess. Thank you so much for coming. I'm sure you can come up, continue the discussions, ask to see weather cups and Faraday bags. If not, we'll probably see you here next year. Thanks again.